Ladies and gentlemen, before I introduce our speaker, I need to say a few words about my friend James Q. Wilson, who died earlier this morning. He was a long-time teacher in the government department at Harvard for about a quarter of a century. He was a Californian. Went to the University of Redlands as an undergraduate and got his PhD at the University of Chicago, taught there for a few years, and then came to Harvard. And at the end of his career, he went off to Malibu to live in a house, which is a dream house, which he and his wife made for themselves. He was the most complete political scientist of his generation. You can see this from his scholarship, which began with a book on the amateur Democrat, the McGovernite phenomenon and the Democratic Party. Then he wrote a book called Negro Politics, as it was called then, introducing the subject of ethnicity to political science. He didn't lead a life of crime, but he created the field of crime as a subject for political science. He wrote a book on crime and human nature, made a study of the FBI, of which it was rumored he was once offered to be chief of. He wrote a study on bureaucracy, of which he, again, the first to introduce that subject to political science. Before it had just been administration, public administration. And towards the end of his life, he got interested in political theory and moral theory, wrote a book on the moral sense and on the notion of character. And he did many other things too. He wrote the best textbook on American politics, and it was one triumph after another in the field of scholarship. He was a fearless man, though he never needed to be fearless because he never took a false step. He had a wonderfully strong heart that was aided and somewhat concealed by his sovereign prudence, his sang-froid. He never said a word that he later had to regret. No one was more conservative, but no conservative was ever more presentable than James Q. Wilson. He managed to make himself, or get himself elected president of the American Political Science Association. And he's had many high positions in Washington, in commissions on crime, and on the federal bureaucracy. There was never any more authoritative opinion than when you'd heard his. In the late 60s, he saved Harvard, not single-handedly, but principally from the troubles it suffered in those turbulent time. He then became chairman of the government department. In some ways, the least of his attainments, but he was the best chairman that we've had in the half-century that I've been here. He redid the whole curriculum of political science. From the day that I met him, he was a friend for life. Okay. I have to announce that our speaker for next week has canceled and won't be able to come. That's Erwin Stelzer. So we'll try to schedule him perhaps for next fall. Now, Jay Cost. Jay Cost is he's essentially a graduate student. That's what he is. Even a graduate student in political theory. Who got shunted off, I don't know if that's the correct expression, into American politics at the University of Chicago. And, excuse me, and then shutted himself off and said, do something more interesting. which is a profession you might call high journalism. That's journalism with scholarship and understanding and with a point of view, but with intelligence and an outlook that transcends his mere advocacy. He's born in the great state of Pennsylvania and lives now in Pittsburgh, where he carries on his high journalism from his basement.
Yes.
Yeah. And you know, since we now live in the computer age, he writes a column called the Morning Jay at the Weekly Standard, and he's other similar publications, and he has a book in store for us, which is called Spoiled Rotten, a study of the Democratic Party. Jay Cost. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me to speak here today, Dr. Mansfield. I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia, and you know, when I was at UVA, we fancied ourselves the Harvard of the South. But you know, I've been out of UVA for 10 years, and I've met a lot of Harvard graduates, and not one of them has ever told me they thought of Harvard as the UVA of the North. So it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here. And as you can see today, I'm going to be talking about the 2012 presidential election. And what I want to do is sort of break my talk into two parts. The first part is going to be a brief overview of the horse race with a particular focus on macro level quantitative data so we can really drill down, use some numbers, and get a real sense of where things stand. And the second section is going to be looking at historical perspective to provide hopefully a more qualitative interpretation of what I think this election is going to mean. So let's start with the hard data. Right now, the conventional wisdom seems to be that President Obama is a favorite to win re-election. Probably a pretty good one at that, heavy one. And you know, the best avatar of the conventional wisdom tends to be the intrade prediction market, where people can buy futures contracts based on what they think is going to happen in November. And we can see here, this is the futures contract for President Obama's re-election running through last year and up to the present day. And what we can see here is that according to the futures market, President Obama has a little better than a 60% chance of winning in November. Now, I think that if I was in this futures market, I would be short on this one. I would sell this. I think this is very overpriced. And the reason why is that presidential elections are, when you get right down to it, they're popularity contests. And of course, the Electoral College mediates them, but nevertheless, you have to be popular to win. And Obama's problem is that he's just not that popular. This is the latest readout from the Real Clear Politics average of President Obama's job approval polls, and you can see it runs from the beginning of his tenure to the present.
The horizontal line is 50%.
That's right. The horizontal line is 50%, and I penciled that in there to sort of make the point that, as you can see, that with the exception of just relatively two brief periods, when he signed the payroll tax cut last December 2010, and then the assassination or the killing of Osama bin Laden in the spring of last year, with those two exceptions, he's been under 50%. And you can see there that he's basically been under 50% for more than 2 years. Now, obviously, this is not a deep level of unpopularity. I mean, this is not where George W. Bush was in the second half of his second term, and it's not where, for instance, Jimmy Carter was for the second half of his only term. But that is really just a function of President Obama's holding together the solid support of the Democratic Party base, which essentially amounts to about 45% or thereabouts of the vote. And that's not, in my opinion, a very significant accomplishment, because in the last 25 years or so, the last quarter century, the Democratic Party has never scored less than 45% of the vote in any presidential or congressional election. So he's really just where he is because he's held the party's base together. But with the all-important block of independent voters, people who actually swing elections, the Gallup poll, which is sort of the oldest and the most august of the national opinion polls, the Gallup poll has regularly shown him at just 40% approval, which is far below the threshold needed for victory in November. And in historical context, we see that Obama has been one of the more unpopular presidents. Again, not deeply unpopular, but this chart examines, for the first 13 quarters of a presidential tenure, how many quarters did the Gallup poll have the occupant of the White House under 50% approval. And as you can see, Obama ranks at the very bottom. And he also is the only one with the distinction, so to speak, of having 8 straight quarters in a row under 50% approval. Bill Clinton had 9 quarters under 50% approval, but by this point, which would be the winter of 1996, Bill Clinton was already back above 50% approval. Of course, as they say in the financial markets, past performance is no guarantee of future results. So the real question then is, what are the prospects for President Obama moving above 50% approval before Election Day? Well, to accomplish that, I think he will have to deal with at least one of 3 very substantial problems that are confronting him. The first challenge is the economy. And from the point of view of the average American, in particular his wallet, Obama's term has been the worst performing economy in 50 years. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this graph, which I pulled from the Federal Reserve, tracks the real disposable per capita income for every presidential term going back to the JFK LBJ term in 1960. And what I've done here is, for the sake of consistency, so we can have an apples-to-apples comparison, I've indexed the numbers so that the start of a presidential term, whatever the income level is, it's set at 100. And so what you can see here is, real incomes took off under LBJ and Nixon and Reagan, and to a lesser extent under Bill Clinton. Ford, Carter, and George H.W. Bush 41 all had problems with it. But President Obama is the only president in the last 50 years and several generations where we see a decline in real disposable income per capita during his tenure. And I would note as well that the Bureau of Economic Analysis came out with its January reading on real income per capita, and it was another decline month over month. Now, the president has enjoyed some good news, some good headlines at least, because of perceived drops in the unemployment rate. But in fact, most of the decline in the rate over the last year has been because people are dropping out of the labor force. In fact, the number of jobs that the economy is adding is not keeping up with population. And I've accounted for that here by comparing the official rate, which stands now at 8.3%, against what I call the shadow unemployment rate. And I determined the shadow unemployment rate by setting the participation rate, the percentage of adults who aren't in jail, setting that participation rate at what it was when President Obama took office in January 2009. And as you can see, when we account for in other words, for the number of people who have dropped out of the workforce, if we put them back into the workforce, the real unemployment rate would be something closer to 11%. And the declines over the last couple of months have been mostly ephemeral, at least in terms of, as you can see, the final couple readouts on the shadow rate, we've seen an uptick. So President Obama's second substantial problem is the budget deficit. And to put the size of that challenge into context, I've created this chart, which graphs the annual federal budget deficit as a share of private sector gross domestic product. And as you can see, we have hit an all-time high I didn't graph before 1960, but outside of the period of World War II, we've never seen levels that are this high. And the rate of decline has been very slow, considering the enormous increase during the 2009 recession. And the deficit is, contrary to the opinions of some people I read, the deficit is actually a very salient political issue. And in large part because it's so easily grasped by the average American on an intuitive level. We all know that we have to balance our checkbook, and if we don't, sooner or later something bad is going to happen to us. So when Americans see a budget deficit now measured in the trillions of dollars, they know that something is wrong. And of course, we can't forget this fellow, who won, I should say, 20 years ago. Ross Perot won the votes out of nearly 1 out of 5 citizens, which is extraordinary when you think about it, what a peculiar character he was, and the peculiar nature of his presidential campaign. I mean, it just wasn't Perot as a person, but you'll recall he dropped out and then came back in and was very erratic, and he still won a little over 18% of the vote. And his main issue that year was the budget deficit. The budget deficit in 1992 was roughly 5% of private sector GDP. It is now 10%. The third challenge, but not the least significant of them, but the third challenge is Obamacare, otherwise known as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And President Obama's big problem with the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is that it doesn't protect patients and it doesn't make care affordable. And that's exactly the point that the Republicans are going to hammer home in November. They're going to talk, and by the way, they're going to cite official government reports like the Congressional Budget Office to discuss the millions of people who are going to lose their current employer-based health insurance, contrary to the president's claim, the $500 billion that are going to be taken from Medicare, and the fact that, what the Democrats basically did, regardless of what your thoughts about the bill was, the reality is that the Democrats shoehorned a $3 trillion bill into a $1 trillion package. It's in fact a budget buster that doesn't have appropriate pay-fors, and the Republicans are going to hammer that relentlessly. So, all in all, this presents a very challenging macro environment for anybody to win re-election. President Obama's team has made it clear that they intend to run hard against the Republican nominee, casting him, of course, as an extremist. Now, I'm not really sure how a party that consistently wins 50% of the vote or more can be extreme. How can you be extreme and be in a majority of the country? But nevertheless, that's the tack that the president's team has clearly decided to take. And so the question is, can it work? Well, the template for that, at least in theory, is the 2004 election. Conventional wisdom, as it's been handed down to us, is that George W. Bush was unpopular that year, and he managed to win because he made John Kerry simply unacceptable. He swift-voted him, as the Democrats charged. But in fact, the facts do not support this assertion. And to appreciate this, I've produced this chart, which is taken from the 2004 exit poll. So there's 2 points I want to make about this chart. The first one is that George W. Bush on Election Day in 2004 was actually popular. Now, he wasn't overwhelmingly popular, but he did have 53% approval from voters. And his net favorability on Election Day was +7. Second point I would make is if you look in the bottom right cell, those are the people who supposedly were susceptible to the swift voting attack. These are the people who disapproved of President Bush, but who voted for him anyway because John Kerry was just an effete northeastern liberal. And as you can see, it was only 6% of Bush disapprovers voted for him anyway. And in fact, Bush's bigger problem was that 9% of Bush approvers voted for Kerry. So in other words, the attacks on Kerry did not make a substantial difference on Election Day. Instead, the election in 2004 was overwhelmingly a referendum on President Bush. And that's exactly what we see when we look in historical context. Just to scroll back real quick, the bottom right cell, 6% disapproved of Bush but voted for him anyway. Those are the numbers I've presented here. And as you can see, most of the time, it's actually less than 10%. There were only 2 exceptions, Nixon in 1972 and Jimmy Carter in 1980. both of those higher levels of disapprovers who voted for him anyway had much more to do with the breakdown of the Democratic Party that year. In 1972, the white working class, which had historically been Democratic, abandoned the Democratic Party in droves to vote for Nixon because McGovern was sort of, at least as major party nominees go, he was on the more radical side of major party nominees, and he turned off the white working class. Jimmy Carter in 1980 had very low levels of approval, especially among liberal Democrats, but they nevertheless, most of them voted for him anyway because they were scared of Ronald Reagan. So what we see, in other words, is that it's really not sufficient for a president to win electoral victory, to win re-election by simply merely railing against the so-called extremism of the opposition. Instead, this president, in my opinion, is going to have to produce at least some modest progress on those three items I mentioned before: the economy, the deficit, and healthcare. So, moving away from the horse race analysis, I'd like to turn now to the bigger picture. Namely, how is 2012 going to fit into the long history of presidential elections when it's all said and done? And as I sort of alluded to at the beginning of my talk, this is a more qualitative, interpretive section. This is sort of my understanding, how I'm sort of conceiving of the election as I go through the process of writing about it on the day-to-day. And I think, as the title alluded, I think it could be a very substantial, pivotal election, as I believe that it is the first election in a generation, at least a generation, arguably multiple generations, when the country has to vote amidst a decisive shift in the American political economy. And I think that shift is in the process of reigniting a very old ideological cleavage. To make this point, I need to do two things. The first is I have to define what ideological battle I'm talking about, and second, explain why it might be reappearing now in 2012. So let's take them in turn and look at the ideological battle. Since the earliest days of our constitutional system, right almost immediately after George Washington was inaugurated in 1789, there has been a political conflict in this country between two broad groups who you can very loosely title the nationalists and the egalitarians. The nationalist philosophy essentially boils down to the promotion of vigorous government activity to grow industry and commerce, in the belief that over time such policies will generate broad-based prosperity and unite the country under a shared pro-growth economic output. One of the first articulations of this philosophy can be found in Federalist number 11, which was written by Alexander Hamilton. In it, he advocates a new constitutional union because of the beneficial impact that it would have on the economy. Hamilton wrote, quote, "An unrestrained intercourse between the states themselves will advance the trade of each by an interchange of their respective productions, not only for the supply of reciprocal wants at home, but for exportation to foreign markets." And this is the essential point. "The veins of commerce in every part will be replenished and acquire additional motion and vigor from a free circulation of the commodities of every part. Commercial enterprise will have much greater scope from the diversity in the productions of different states." What Hamilton is arguing here is that the national government that the Constitutional Convention produced could generate a national economic growth by creating uniform commercial and trade laws. And Hamilton followed this belief up as Secretary of the Treasury. During the Washington administration, he was central in enacting an economic program that included federal assumption of war debts, repayment of debt at face value, and especially the Bank of the United States. And he believed that this program would establish the creditworthiness of the country and thus promote economic growth and, in time, broad prosperity. And one of his most significant works, although it wasn't implemented into law at the time, but his report on manufacturers in 1792 actually anticipated much of the 19th century conservative Republican economic program by calling for protective tariffs, tax exemptions, and facilitation of transportation. Now, this view forms, in my opinion, this view continues to form the foundations of the modern Republican Party, including its conservative wing, although the connection is at times subtle. And the reason is that conservatives today, conservative rhetoric consistently talks about limited government, But Hamilton was, for the time, an advocate of big government. So how do we bridge this gap? Well, the difference is accounted for in the rise of the progressive movement, which did not really exist in the 1790s. When the progressives came about and sort of rose to political prominence, they pushed for an active government to regulate business and redistribute income among classes. Conservatives of today favor limited government vis-a-vis the progressives, but they are as activist as ever when viewed from the Hamiltonian perspective, in that they prefer government that encourages business growth. And indeed, from an abstract philosophical perspective, I see very little difference between the protective tariff regime of the 19th century and supply-side economics of the Reagan administration, in that both sought to use federal government tax policy to stimulate business development and economic growth. But this Hamiltonian view of the federal government has long provoked intense opposition, with critics usually blasting the philosophy as inherently unequal and anti-republican. The first Bank of the United States was, of course, the original point of conflict. Hamilton saw it as a vehicle to promote capital investment in the country, which in time would benefit all Americans. But Hamilton's opponents, led by Thomas Jefferson, viewed it as a tool of the elite in New York and the Northeast to enhance their wealth and power at the expense of Virginia farmers. And Andrew Jackson thought that the inequalities in wealth and status created by the bank far outweighed whatever economic benefits it might provide. So when President Jackson vetoed a bill in 1832 to recharter the second bank, he issued a stern rebuke in his veto message, which I think to this day remains the most persuasive and impressive articulation of the egalitarian critique of Hamilton's nationalism. Jackson wrote, quote, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. When the laws undertake to add artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, and laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government." And in fact, this famous bank veto message, Ted Kennedy, in his 1980 Dream Will Never Die speech at the Democratic National Convention, actually cited this passage at length. Now, the cleavages of the early Jacksonian period eventually gave way to a battle over slavery, and then, of course, the Civil War, and finally, from roughly the Grant administration through the Cleveland administration, a so-called Gilded Age of meaningless party bickering over patronage and petty grievances. This Hamiltonian Jeffersonian divide really fell into the background. And it wasn't until the very nasty economic downturn that followed the Panic of 1893 that the two parties were forced to return to dealing with these two different outlooks. And it had to do with the farms that year. Farmers of the Great Plains had it worse than anybody in the 1890s, and their frustrations gave rise to the Populist Party, whose spirit in turn overtook the Democrats in 1896. And the issue that year was not the Bank of the United States, which had never been revived after Jackson destroyed it, but it was instead the de facto gold standard the country had adopted to stabilize the currency in lieu of a central financial institution. William McKinley, who by that point had become the leader of the Hamiltonian Henry Clay conservative nationalist wing, believed that the gold standard and the protective tariff were part of a pro-growth economic regime that benefited all Americans, and hence his campaign titled "The Full Dinner Pail" was his chief slogan. In other words, Republican pro-growth policies will offer everybody a full dinner pail. But William Jennings Bryan and his populist Democrats disagreed. They wanted to do away with the gold standard and institute the unlimited coinage of silver, which they hoped would generate inflation, which would shift a portion of the national wealth from creditors in the Northeast to debtors in the West. So in other words, we have here, again, in 1896, the classic divide between the pro-growth nationalists and the egalitarians. And Bryan's stirring cross of gold speech at the 1896 convention swung the nomination to him, and it's worth quoting because when you listen to Democratic politicians, they still reference these basic ideas. Bryan said there are two ideas of government. There are those who believe that if you just legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, that their prosperity will leak through on those below. The democratic idea has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up and through every class that rests upon it. That's very reminiscent of the democratic critique of the 1980s of Reaganomics, trickle-down economics. He called it leak-through economics. But it points to this core sort of enduring disagreement between the two parties. And at the time, political observers must have thought that this was going to be the start of a new trend, of sort of a return to this pitched ideological battle. But things didn't really happen that way. Instead, just as in 1832, the philosophical divide again faded into the background. The big reason was economic growth. Despite the persistence of the business cycle, including a couple nasty recessions, the real size of the American economy almost quadrupled between the Panic of 1893 and the Great Depression. And while the Depression destroyed about 25% of the national income, the country began climbing quickly out of the hole by 1934. And we can see here the extraordinary scope of the post-war economic boom. For 55 years after World War II, the American economy grew like gangbusters, averaging 3.5% economic growth per year. And this was so substantial, and the reason I wanted to produce this, you can see how it affected the average American, because between 1959 and 1999, this is again real income per capita, so this is the purchasing power of the money people have in their wallets. That tripled in 50 years, which is extraordinary. And it made for a great time to be in government. It was a great time to be in government. As this graph shows here, what I did is track the average percentage increase or decrease in government tax receipts during the same period. And obviously there are ups and downs, but the dotted line is the average over the period, and you can see it's roughly 9%, which means that year over year the federal government, or the state and local governments combined, collected 9% more in tax revenues than the year before, year in and year out. So, because of the fantastic growth in the economy, the old cleavages really faded into the background, because they could keep taxes low. Taxes as a share of GDP don't really increase much during this period. Instead, they're just collecting more money because the economy is growing, and income taxes are pegged on essentially economic growth. So could keep taxes low on individuals, on businesses and capital owners, keep those low while you increase social welfare spending per person, which grew by more than 20% in every decade following World War II. It could grow domestic discretionary spending, which increased in every decade except the 1980s. And of course, national defense spending expands dramatically during this period to deal with the Soviet threat. In other words, economic growth in the post-war period liberated policymakers from having to make really any hard choices between the philosophies of nationalism and egalitarianism. The people could have guns and butter and low taxes and a reasonable budget deficit, all thanks to a private economy that seemed to grow regardless of what the government did. And importantly, the two political parties during this period were more than happy to blur the ideological distinctions that separated them. I mean, there's the rhetoric that the Daily Kos offers its readers and the rhetoric that Rush Limbaugh offers his listeners. But when party politicians are in office, it was regularly a different story. For instance, the 1964 Revenue Act slashed the top marginal tax rate by 24% and the corporate tax rate by 10%. And it was overwhelmingly supported by Northern liberal Democrats. Similarly, in 1981, Southern Democrats were essential to the passage of the Reagan tax cuts. So in other words, Democrats who normally are on the egalitarian side of the coin and favor increased social welfare spending got to dabble in tax cuts, right? Just as Democrats got to dabble in tax cuts, Republicans could dabble in social welfare spending. Congressional Republicans in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s consistently and overwhelmingly supported expansions to Social Security. It was in fact the Nixon administration in 1972 that pushed through the largest expansion of Social Security since the original program, which was the indexing of it for inflation and also the Supplemental Security Income Program. And of course, Republicans voted overwhelmingly for the Medicare bill in 1965. The Republican alternative to Medicare was actually a big government program. It was offered by a conservative named John Burns from Wisconsin. And of course, in this early part of the last decade, it was George W. Bush and a supposedly radical extremist conservative House that added the prescription drug benefit to the program. To put all of this another way, put it in context, when the economy is growing at an average of 3.5% per year, it is amazing how compatible the views of Jefferson and Hamilton become, at least in terms of practical politics. But the tide began to turn starting around the year 2000. And we can see that here. I've taken that income graph that went from 1959 to 1999, and I've expanded it through to the current date. And you can see here that we see the start of a slowdown around the year 2000. A relatively modest recession produced a lengthy stagnation in income. Income never really gets back to the trend before we have the most recent recession and the precipitous collapse in income. I mean, you see, we've never had a collapse in income in this country in the post-war era. Instead, what we just see is income flatlining. Well, income collapsed starting with this recession, and it really hasn't recovered. As I mentioned several times, the Bureau of Economic Analysis just came out with its latest read for January. I mean, we're supposedly in our third year of recovery, and incomes are still in decline. And that income gap works out to be, in current dollars, $4,500 per person, which works out to be $1.4 trillion missing from the national economy. And all of this is a consequence of weak economic growth. Over the last decade, the real GDP has increased by just an average of 1.7% per year, which is less than half of the post-war average. And certainly not, and when you consider that population increases by about 1% per year, and real GDP is only increasing by 1.7%, it's not really enough to create prosperity, or each individual feels like he's enjoying more and more. It's also wreaked havoc on our tax revenues. As I mentioned previously, in the 50 years from 1960 to 2000, on average, tax revenues increased by 9% per year.
Sorry, 50?
1959 to 1999, tax revenues on average increased by 9% per year.
40 years, you said 50.
Yeah, thank you. But as you can see here, tax revenues plummeted from the 2001 recession, rebounded briefly, but then collapsed, and we still haven't filled back in the hole. The government at all levels is taking in less money this year than it did in 2007. And I add, these are nominal dollars, these are not adjusted for inflation. So over the last decade, we've only collected 20% more revenue, which, over the previous, 2 generations, we would have, the amount of revenue we would have collected, extra revenue in just 12 years would have been, almost double. But here we've just collected just 20% more. And this continued economic weakness, and the estimates of the blue chip economists that I've seen this year project continued weakness, growth well below the post-war trend line. This is putting tremendous political pressure on the post-war settlement, right? The idea of guns, butter, low taxes, and a manageable deficit. Something has to give. And it's exacerbated by our health spending. This graph is from the Congressional Budget Office, and it projects our debt as a share of GDP over the next 80 years if we keep taxes low, and we're low by the standard of where they are right now, and do not reform our social welfare spending. And you'll notice that I have a little nod, a little line between 100 and 200. That's 180%. That's debt, 180% of GDP, which is where Greece is right now. According to CBO's projections, we're scheduled to hit that within the next 20 years if we don't make substantial reforms. So all of this is why I believe that the 2012 election could be sort of the return of the old political cleavage. When we no longer have economic growth that's large enough to facilitate low taxes and generous social welfare spending, country is going to be forced to choose between the two sides, or if not directly, either all budget cuts or tax hikes, some mix between the two, but with the balance inevitably favoring one side or the other. And increasingly, we're seeing signs that this campaign is actually going to be about this old debate. For instance, compare President Obama's fiscal year 2013 budget to the Paul Ryan roadmap. President Obama calls for increased taxes on the wealthy, as he defines that group, with virtually no adjustments and certainly no significant adjustments to the social welfare state, which is now, by the way, providing for more people than ever. Roughly 16% of the country is now on food stamps. And so when you have tax increases and increased social welfare benefits, absent economic growth, you're not talking about taxing the surplus that the economy generates every year. What you're in fact talking about is taking money currently held by one person and giving it in the form of goods and services to another person. Or in other words, straight up redistribution, which is something we haven't had to do in the post-war era because of economic growth. This is exactly the sort of political program William Jennings Bryan promoted in 1896 and Andrew Jackson offered in 1832. The sort of idea of transferring wealth and resources from one class of the citizenry to another. Paul Ryan, on the other hand, looks to keep taxes low, reform Medicare, which is really a modern twist on the nationalist philosophy. Ryan and Republicans don't want to double the rate of taxation to basically pay for the doubling of the size of the government because they are worried that it would cripple businesses and grind the economy to a halt. And similarly, Republicans are again talking about fundamental tax reform, making the tax system simpler and fairer and easier to work with to facilitate business growth, which is something that hasn't happened in a quarter century. And they're even now talking seriously about comprehensive health care reform, not just wiping Obamacare from the books, but instead making a serious and sustained bid to lower the cost of care under the hope that it would reduce the size and scope of the healthcare burden on businesses and therefore rehabilitate private sector growth. So if the Democrats are becoming more Bryan-esque, I believe the Republicans right now are becoming more Hamiltonian. And finally, we're also seeing it in the rhetoric of President Obama and Mitt Romney. I mean, contrast the electoral rhetoric this year to the rhetoric of the 2000 presidential campaign, where Bush and Gore were fighting over the level of the tax cut that they would offer and whether or not they would put money in a Social Security lockbox. I mean, the rhetorical pitch has really shifted. Barack Obama is consistently now talking about fairness. It's a theme that he's consistently sort of pouting, and that's his way of articulating the idea of raising taxes on the wealthy to keep federal outlays roughly constant. Meanwhile, Mitt Romney, if you watched his Michigan victory speech the other night, he talked time and again about an opportunity society. He talked about balancing the budget, and he talked about cutting taxes. So what he's implicitly offering is substantial cuts in the budget to keep the tax burden on businesses and families low. So that's the classic divide between these two great philosophies. And over the long run, my opinion is that the only way this dispute will ever be settled is through economic growth, powerful enough to elevate the lower classes either directly through better private sector prospects or through increased social welfare spending. If we see a return to that trend line in the post-war era of 3.5% growth per year, we're going to see the two political parties put this cleavage into the background. It'll still be there to rally the bases of both sides, but it'll slide into the background. But if we continue to see growth that's well below trend and a corresponding strain on the federal budget deficit, this could very well be the wave of the future. Only time will tell. In the meantime, I thank you for your time.
Very good. You want to start the questions?
Sure. Thank you for a terrific talk,
I can sit.
which I found really helpful. And I have a number of questions.
Give us your most important one.
Right, of course. Problem, like the country, I have a problem of selection. Okay. It would be nice, I agree with you, it would be nice to have a decision on for 2012 to be pivotal. Why isn't it more likely, alas, that we'll have gridlock, or we'll have, well, that we'll kick the can down the road, which I think has dominated recent years in American politics. And my second question, I'm wondering if you could bring in Teddy Roosevelt, and particularly the Osawatomie speech by Teddy, that Obama made so much of in a recent speech, perhaps stealing the enemy's ammunition. Right.
Well, I think in terms of gridlock, I think gridlock is a luxury. Really, I mean, it's a luxury to be able to do nothing. And it's you know, like I said, or as I suggested in the presentation, I think politics has been bankrolled by a luxurious growth in the American economy over the last generations, multiple generations. And I mean, if you look at what's happening in Greece and Europe and the trajectory of our debt level, and not just the debt that's on the books right now, but you know, when you look at the economic reports that are produced by the Office of Management and Budget, and by the way, this isn't a partisan critique, both sides play these games. The Congressional Budget Office, when it's run by Republicans and Democrats, both sides play these games. They all project the budget deficit is going to disappear over the next couple years. Why? Because we're going to suddenly magically get back to 4% economic growth. My contention would be that if that doesn't happen, in other words, if we are at a new normal of 2% economic growth, our problem as a country is that over, you know, the 40, 50-year period from the end of World War II to the turn of the most recent century, our politicians made political promises built on assumptions that 4%, 3.5% growth would continue. So if that doesn't happen, policymakers in Washington, D.C. are going to have to do something about it because the bondholders are essentially going to force them. I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing in Greece and in the PIGS countries in Southern Europe, right? Is they don't want to deal with these problems. It's just that the bondholders are forcing them to. And if we continue, I mean, that's ultimately the problem is that Medicare and Social Security were programs that were built when the economy was going gangbusters. At least Social Security, as it currently is, was created that way. Now we have the baby boom generation sort of coming into retirement. We simply have bills that we can't pay. Something is going to have to happen. There's no, in other words, you can kick the can down the road until you run out of road. And I think that's about what we're sort of facing unless we see significant, these sorts of problems, you can always grow your way out of them. But if we grow our way out of them, then yeah, they'll continue to kick the can down the road, split the difference, claim victory, leave it for the next generation. They'll do, in other words, what they always do.
Oh, could you answer?
Oh yeah, what was your second question? Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I think that you know, that's sort of you know, Teddy Roosevelt was not in the conservative camp of the Republican Party in a lot of, certainly not by the time he came back after his tenure as president. Certainly not in his second term. He had shifted to the left and had become. I mean, I think that the progressive Roosevelt would be more comfortable in the Democratic Party today than in the Republican Party. The progressive version of Teddy Roosevelt, I would say. And I think that's exactly what President Obama is doing. I mean, he's appropriating the language of fairness and equity, and it's a subtext for, I mean, if you translate the rhetoric into purely budgetary matters, what he's talking about is keeping federal outlays roughly constant and paying for them with increased tax rates, and that's fairness. He calls that fairness. Now, I personally disagree with that, but I'm trying, you know, looking at things from an analytical standpoint, not an ideological standpoint. I mean, and you could say the same thing about Romney and Republicans. They call cutting government spending and keeping taxes low opportunity. If you're a liberal Democrat, you scoff at that idea, just as you scoff, if you're a conservative Republican, you scoff at the idea of, you know, high government spending being tantamount to fairness, but these are the words and phrases and concepts and ideas that the two parties choose to sort of couch their budgetary proposals.
Danilo.
Since much of your analysis, your framing depends on these two terms, nationalism and egalitarianism, these two political traditions, even philosophies you call them, that you see dividing America in a kind of essentialist fashion from the founding through today. I was curious if you just maybe want to take 2 or 3 minutes and say how you came up with these terms, how you saw these two terms opposed to each other, so fundamental to the American traditions, and what was your, as we'd say in political science, method in determining these, why these two philosophies are so key in characterizing this, and how they've remained so over the years. They haven't changed much. It seemed to be one of the implications.
No, I don't think they have. I mean, I think that the policy proposals that they suggest, like for instance, the Republican Party is now the party of free trade, whereas it used to be the party of protective tariffs. So why the shift? Well, they haven't become anti-business. It's just that the needs of businesses have changed. Before World War II, when the United States was primarily in competition with Great Britain, who in many cases produced superior products, American industry needed protective tariffs to protect themselves from a superior and lower cost British imports. But after World War II, after Britain basically bankrupts itself to push back the Nazi threat, and Europe is in ruins, and Japan's in ruins, American businesses are sort of unparalleled, unchallenged in the international scene, and they start calling for low tariffs. And lo and behold, the Republican Party starts advocating for things like NAFTA. Now, it's sort of it's difficult to sort of, and it's one reason why I broke the talk so explicitly into 2 parts, right? I mean, and as Professor Mansfield suggested, I sort of straddled 2 universes in political science. The first part was my hard data, quantitative American politics, and the second part was sort of my interpretive political theory style read on it. And the idea that it developed is just sort of born of, quite truthfully, of my affection for Henry Clay, and the sort of recognition that Henry Clay, it was a book idea I pitched to my editor and he turned it down, which was very unfortunate because I really wish I could have written it, but arguing that Henry Clay was the first Republican, and sort of the Clay program of protective tariffs and internal improvements, the idea being economic growth for the whole country. I see modern republicanism as just being sort of an updated version of that in a lot of respects.
It's interesting that Obama, I think, does not use the term new nationalism.
No.
Teddy Roosevelt used, or the national system that Henry Clay referred to.
No, Obama is very clearly couching himself in the redistributionist language that was used by Jackson, that was used by William Jennings Bryan, certainly by Harry Truman. I mean, this is sort of the us versus them style campaign that's characterized this kind of viewpoint. And of course, the big challenge is in sort of seeing this is you have to sort of account for the fact that progressivism didn't really exist in really any form before the 1890s. There was no political philosophy that was at least dominant in mainstream American politics that called for what Herbert Crawley called it Hamiltonian ends for Jefferson, or Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends, which is sort of the way you need to sort of look at the political battle now, is the shift on the left, which moved from being small government egalitarianism like Jefferson, Jackson, and Bryan into big government egalitarianism like, frankly, TR and Roosevelt, FDR, Truman, and now Obama. Yeah.
Yes.
So I find the argument broadly persuasive, but kind of like Danilo, I'm wondering a little bit about the continuity of these historical perspectives, and particularly so on this question of tariffs and sort of the political economy of American nationalism. It strikes me that what businesses want in politics often aren't maybe in the interest of long-term prosperity. So this is like a standard political economy critique of rent-seeking today, that businesses lobby for their exemptions and tariffs and monopolies and whatnot. And in some ways, I think a lot of political economists today sound a lot more like Jackson in the veto speech, that we want a system that doesn't give out special economic favors. And probably one of the biggest shifts in American political economy in the 18th or 19th century is you have this change from charters and charter regimes, basically going from politically legislated charter to completely open access. Anyone can apply, get a business license, etc. And I wonder, I mean, today, I wonder if American nationalism today wouldn't actually present a dilemma for big businesses right now, which I think donate often very much on both sides of the political aisle, interested in maintaining various sorts of economic rents that are probably to the detriment of a long-term economic prosperity. Is that something, is that going to clearly fall on one side or the other of the Republican-Democratic divide? Is that something that's ultimately, is there a long-term interest where you can get big businesses on the side of, you know, opening up competition, which is ultimately going to dissipate some of their rents that they enjoy from a kind of regulatory, you know, basically special interest lobbying?
That's such a good question. I think one of the reasons why, you know, businesses play both sides now, you know, because Thomas Jefferson was never, and Andrew Jackson were not, you know, they weren't in the business of offering up rents, right? They were small government people, you know, and, you know, even the sort of the spoils system that develops in Jackson's administration really doesn't take off until later. You know, it's a problem though with a government that is big enough to do great, wonderful things like promote American economic growth a la Hamilton or promote equality a la Teddy Roosevelt, Herbert Croly, FDR, is also a government that's, you know, big enough to play favorites. And this has been an enduring tension in the Republican Party, you know, for generations. I mean, I think for me, is sort of the classic example is sort of William McKinley, who's another favorite of mine, sort of the Paul Ryan of the 19th century, the original policy wonk, who actually wrote a book about the tariff. You know, nevertheless, the McKinley tariff of, what was it, 1889, was replete with political payoffs. I mean, it's sort of the challenge that I think now that we have we used to have a big government party and a small government party. I think now we actually have two big government parties. It's just that their objectives, what they want to do with big government, are very different. And so I think that's a challenge. That's been a persistent problem. And you know, look, it's been a problem. The Democratic Party has had this problem, you know, going back to the New Deal. I mean, FDR, when he was expanding, you know, for instance, FDR chose to destroy Tammany Hall, used the power of the federal government to destroy Tammany Hall, and the Philadelphia machine used the patronage powers of the Works Progress Administration to destroy both of those operations. But he saved the burgeoning Chicago machine. He saved the machine in Albany, he saved the machine in San Francisco and Jersey City. Well, why? It's because, well, the machine in Tammany, Tammany was against him in the 32 nomination, and the Philadelphia machine was Republican. So, I mean, it's an enduring challenge, I think. It's the one, now that we have, you know, a progressive party and a Hamiltonian party, they're both susceptible to it. And businesses have been extremely smart in exploiting campaign finance. I don't want to say exploit because it gives us sort of, I mean, the laws are what they are. Actually, organized labor is responsible for our miserable campaign finance laws today. But, you know, using the laws on the books and using the committee system in particular to, you know, gain access and, as you said, gain rents. And they've become very adept at playing both sides, which is very unfortunate, I think. And I think you're right. I think it does. I think it sort of blurs the lines. And like I said, I don't see this as an enduring. This is not a political cleavage that the two parties like to engage in, because it splits people. It splits people into two groups, and parties don't like to split people into groups. They'd much rather win 60% than 40%. So they'd much rather really make the argument that there's no difference between me and the other guy, except the other guy's a crook and I'm an angel. They don't want to talk about, you know, Hamilton versus Jefferson. They don't want to talk about political economy in ways. Because what we're really talking about here, you know, what we're really talking about, even the Hamiltonian idea produces winners and losers, at least in the short run. And that's what we're talking about here. We are talking about economic growth coming in so far below trend line that our government is now going to have to start choosing winners and losers in society. Politicians hate doing that, and they resist it. They do everything they can to resist it. So I don't see this as being an enduring political cleavage unless it's forced by the economy. And I note as well, I mean, they didn't want to talk about in the Gilded Age. It was only the Panic of 1893 and the massive, social unrest and the depression and unemployment. Similarly, in the 1890s under Cleveland's second administration was upwards of 10%. You see rioting, Pullman strike, for instance, and the strike at Carnegie Steel in Pittsburgh, the Homestead strike. Just a sort of social unrest forced the two parties, and that's what I'm sort of suggesting here is parties are going to be pushed against their will into discussing this.
Yes, and
How do you reconcile the corporatism that we see today with the Democrats, with the Jacksonian ideal that you spoke of?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I said, the key sort of turning point is the rise of progressivism, right? And in particular, how it's sort of, the last truly conservative nominee of the Democratic Party was Al Smith in 1928. John Davis in 1924 were the last sort of old-time conservatives, small government conservatives. And the issue is that, it's sort of, as I alluded to earlier, the idea of a government that's large enough. The progressive movement wanted, their goal was, their critique of American society during the industrial period was, the concentration of capital and the sort of demands of industries to sort of run their equipment all the time had created vast, unprecedented inequalities in wealth and status and leisure. And so what we need is a big government to regulate industry and redistribute income, wealth, power, leisure between the classes. And the issue ultimately is that, as a sort of a, sitting on a cloud and thinking about it in purely philosophic terms, that makes sense. The issue, though, is that, the people who are actually implementing those policies are politicians who are, above all interested in winning re-election. And to win re-election, Democratic politicians over the years have become a lot like Republican politicians, at least in their method, which is to say they're going to use the power of big government as they want to use it to sort of, accomplish their notions of the public good, but they also are prepared to use power of big government to secure their reelection, like what FDR did. FDR, Democrats, for instance, had reformist Democrats in the 19th century hated Tammany Hall. Wilson hated it, Cleveland hated it, Tilden hated it. It was only FDR who killed it. And he could kill it because he had suddenly this hugely expansive federal government that was powerful enough to kill a political machine. And that's sort of the trick, is that FDR killed it because FDR wanted to be renominated in 1936, and he was scared that Tammany Hall would oppose him again, just like it had in 1932. And I think that when you talk about corporatism and the rise of corporatism in the Democratic Party, that how can this party be sort of an at least in sort of broad philosophic terms, egalitarian, corporatist at the same time. The connecting link is, on the one hand, progressivism, but on the other hand, progressivism is implemented by politicians who are aware that they need, how members of Congress are aware, 20 months after they're inaugurated, they stand for re-election again. So they're more than happy to make deals with people, especially now with our campaign finance regime, where they need to raise. And the campaign finance laws are like gasoline on a fire, right? We have a modern television campaign where you have to raise, $1.5 to $2 million to win re-election, more in a lot of districts. But then simultaneously, the Federal Election Campaign Act limits contributions to $5,000, which makes it very difficult and forces politicians to essentially go around to interest groups with their hat in a hand. And businesses are very smart, and they know how to extract benefits for themselves out of those deals. So that's sort of how corporatism has ended up in the Democratic Party.
In my question, I singled out Democrats, with reference to the question of Jackson, but now as a follow-up, are the Republicans equally corporatist?
Oh, they absolutely. I mean, Matt Continenti, who is a colleague of mine at the Weekly Standard, wrote a great book called The K Street Gang. And I think you can see really sort of the tension within the Republican Party Look at the 104th Congress and its sort of reformist instincts, and then contrast that with the much less fondly remembered 106th, 107th, 108th, 109th Congresses, where Tom DeLay established these permanent or seemingly permanent base camps on K Street with interest groups. Absolutely. And at the end of the day, that's the challenge, is that when you talk about Republicans want to cut taxes, and this is not just about cutting taxes to reduce federal revenue, this is about cutting taxes to stimulate economic growth, which is a form of big government. The government's trying to induce behavior. And the Republicans have broad, noble ideas about why they want to do that. The problem is that you can have those broad, noble ideas and try and accomplish them, but you can also have narrow ideas, and you can, write Ross Perot a tax credit all for himself, which almost happened in the late 1980s. That's what happens when you use the tax law as a policy tool to produce behavior you want to produce. You run the risk of corporatism, or clientelism might be a better phrase, because it's something that organized labor is susceptible to that. Urban governments, environmentalists, consumer rights groups, feminists, they're all, there's all sorts of goodies that all sorts of different groups can extract from a big government.
Your economic analysis of the election, you've left out a lot that appears in the newspapers and pundits and so on,
Yeah.
Namely all the cultural issues,
Right.
or the social conservative issues, snobbery on one side or another, things like that, plus foreign policy. Do those really not matter?
They matter. Foreign policy can matter. It was the decisive factor in 2004, for instance. It was a huge factor in 1980. It was a huge factor in 1976. A lot of people thought that Gerald Ford hadn't mistakenly said that Poland was a free country. He could have defeated Jimmy Carter that year. So foreign policy can matter. And not to say that it doesn't, won't matter again soon. It's just that I think what we're seeing right now is the nature of the budget problem that we're facing, and more broadly the economic problem that we're facing, is going to push cultural issues and foreign policy questions onto the margins. Unless, of course, there's some major foreign policy crisis, which obviously there might be. Iran's always sort of squawking about this or that, and someday they might make good on their threats. If that happened, foreign policy could come to dominate it. But I think in this cycle, the nature of just the duration of this economic stagnation and the way that it's hit the average American just square in the jaw, I think, is such that it's going to overwhelm the conversation this year. And I think also I would add that the issues of the deficit and the healthcare bill, I believe that the Romney campaign is going to try and tie those into the economy. In particular, the sort of the difficult financial situation that the average household finds it in. In other words, that President Obama hasn't made things better; he's made things worse. Look at this deficit; we're going to have to pay for it someday, which means you're going to have to pay for it. And look at this healthcare bill; your healthcare costs are going to go up, 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 up under the bill, and they're going to frame that in the context of the squeeze that households are being felt. And I just think that the level of the problem, the significance, the breadth, the depth of the economic problem that the country is facing, at least for 2012, is so substantial that I just don't see there being enough oxygen for a general election battle about, for instance, gay marriage, like we had in 2004. I just don't see there being room in the discussion.
Yes, Rory.
But this is a really interesting talk, and I liked your attempt to sort of sum up the two sides reverting to this nationalist and egalitarian parties. I guess I wanted, though, to maybe sort of press you on how you define them in light of, I guess I say, three, to me, in my mind, very fundamental factors that maybe question whether these are really two fundamental alternatives or two fundamental ideological parties. I guess especially for the egalitarian party, it seems like this has to be a viable, a truly viable, possible trajectory of government and not merely a wishful thinking, if it's to be considered an actual alternative, which therefore is a reversion to 1893, etc. And the biggest problem for me is when you look at those that deficit chart going like this. I mean, if a viable alternative would be, you know, more cars in a city and more highway spending versus maybe more subways and trains and buses, and there's pros and cons, and we can debate that. But whereas the chart you have there is more like we're going off a cliff. One party is putting this chart up, the other party doesn't put this chart up, and so I don't see those as two fundamental, viable, complex principles of justice on either side fighting against one another. I just see one party's focusing on that, the other party not. Right. So that would be one way of putting it. I mean, another way though would be to say, you know, on the other side would be to say, this is the element that the other element of your position, which was that the growth rate is what's key, and therefore the egalitarian position is feasible so long as we can return to, what was it, 3% growth. And therefore the fundamental argument is who or what positions or policies would get us back to 3% growth. Right. And if we can do that, then it's a decision whether we want to redistribute, whether we want a larger or smaller middle class, more or less free enterprise, and that's a kind of principled debate we'd have to have. Because, you know, I bring it up because in the healthcare debate, there just seems to be arguments that internal to the liberal camp or to the Democratic camp, or say internal to Harvard campus, it's mostly a debate about the justice of extending healthcare benefits. Right. In the political scene, it's mostly a debate about the affordability of it and its threat to Medicare. And so it's like there's a kind of schizophrenia. It's like, is it the 3% growth issue, or is it the justice of the egalitarian position versus the justice of the nationalist position? Right. And these both go on at the same time. And I presume that Obama's actual position is he can do what he wants and get back to, and that we will get back to 3% anyway, because the engine of the economy is so powerful and complex that, you know, in reality, he can't really wreck it. He doesn't really fear that his policies really. So I mean, I kind of throw that out to you, this plethora of issues, whether these are two really fundamental, you know, positions that we can choose from, like liberal and conservative or something, like two eternal parties. Or whether there isn't always, what's the independent variable here? It seems like it's economic growth. Right.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I think you've articulated very well why I'm a nationalist, Hamiltonian, rather than look. I mean, I think that the Democratic Party, I think they, I don't know what they. It's hard to gauge what President Obama really thinks about things. It's always been hard to gauge what he really thinks about things. This is a guy who simultaneously had the Chicago Board of Trade and the SEIU in his voting coalition when he ran for the Senate in 2004. I mean, he is all about strange bedfellows and leaving himself maximum leeway, maximum feasibility, sort of wiggle room. He doesn't like making choices like this. Doesn't like, or at least does not like admitting to the fact that he's picking winners and losers. I think that if you talk to Nancy Pelosi, and I think if you talk to liberal Democrats in the House of Representatives, which have been in my opinion, were the main drivers of public policy in the 111th Congress, I don't think that Obama was the main. He was the engine. I think he was instead trying to navigate it, but I think Pelosi was the engine. I think their attitude would be something to the effect of, like, I think, how do we solve this budget crisis from the perspective of Pelosi and the Democrats? I think that they would much rather prefer something closer to Europe, where you have substantially lower economic growth, similar to what we're having now, but layers of taxation and regulation and redistribution designed to mitigate, the sort of the gap, the gap that in that graph of sort of the income gap that government would take from the most wealthy to fill it, and therefore economic growth of the kind in the 80s or 90s. Because remember, the Democrats were not happy in the 80s. And they were not happy in the 1990s. They were not happy with Bill Clinton. They were not. They got behind Bill Clinton in '96 out of fear of the alternative, which was Gingrich-Dole. And, of course, they had the opportunity to return to Clintonism in 2008. They said thank you, but no thank you. And importantly, Clinton and Obama basically tied in the 2008 primaries. It was the party establishment in the form of the superdelegates who broke the tie. It was the party elite who said, we're not going back to that. So, if I had to project what I think the liberal vision is, I would say it's something to the effect of lower economic growth with new revenue streams, something like a value-added tax, I think would be ideal for the Democratic Party. I think it would solve multiple problems for them. It would solve a revenue problem, and then it would also be a way to do something that Democrats have always loved to do, which is to cut checks to people. You look at for instance, look at the liberal farming policy of the New Deal and the New Deal and Fair Deal period. It was all about, essentially buying off the farm vote, which was a swing vote in the country. Democrats just wanted to send checks. VAT could accomplish something like that and accomplish kind of redistributed goals, where you have a VAT 10, 11, 12% or whatever on consumption, and then people who qualify for a rebate check every month get a rebate check, something like that. I think they would prefer that over Reagan-esque, Clinton-esque type of economic growth. I think most of them conceive of the 80s and 90s as missed opportunities rather than methods to return to. I don't think they place as high a premium on economic growth as certainly not as Republicans do.
Just to follow quickly though, and my economics is very weak here, but it seems that economic growth is absolutely crucial. That's why I don't understand. I can understand if do we want it to be more like Sweden or more like America circa 1984. Well, that's a difficult question. But do we want to be more like America or Sweden today and Greece? That's a no-brainer. So
right.
Is this reasonable? This vision they have, is it doable? Lower economic growth and the things they want. That's sort of for me that kind of.
Well, my guess would be no. My guess is that in the long run, it's not. Like for instance, I don't think that. I don't think Jefferson had a coherent fiscal or monetary policy. I don't think Andrew Jackson did. I don't think William Jennings Bryan did. That's but I'm not a liberal Democrat. I don't know how they conceive of these sorts of things. I think that I think, like I said, I think a lot of the liberal Democrats in Congress are much more interested in. They're more interested in carving up a relatively stable pie than growing the pie. I think they're much more interested in sort of, slicing it up in a more equitable fashion. I don't think they're as interested in growing the pie. The graph from CBO, by the way, was CBO. That was their long-term budget forecast that you referenced with this sort of parable. Yeah, they had another chart in there, which was basically what would happen in the alternative scenario where they say the budget deficit remains constant as sort of like 2 or 3% of GDP, and in that scenario. We get to that because what CBO is saying when you break it down, federal health spending is going to double as a share of GDP. Well, actually more than double. It's going to go up to about 17% of GDP. That's where you get that sort of. The problem though becomes, taxes. And CBO's had two scenarios. One is where we keep taxes constant, and the other is we kept taxes to match. And that in that scenario where we raise taxes, that would be. In 80 years, we'd have, the federal government collecting about 30% of GDP in taxes versus, 17% today. Is that something liberal Democrats would want to do? I would say yes. I think that if Republicans compromised on the Bush tax cuts in 2 years, and if the Republicans said, okay, Democrats, the tax rates are at 18% right now, we'll give you 20. In 5 years, the Democrats will come back and ask for 25. You give them 25, they'll come back. 5 years and ask for 30, give them 30, they'll come back and ask for 35. So yeah, I think that's their view. I think that's their conception of things. And I think they would want to solve, because the parabolic nature of that line you saw was because the deficit problem doesn't get dealt with, interest on the debt compounds. So, but if you double the level of taxes in this country, you'd solve the entitlement problem. And that's what I think Democrats want to do. They want to double taxes.
What about the role of Keynesianism?
Well, they love Keynes. I mean, Keynesianism is...
Doesn't that suggest that you can have fairness and economic growth?
They do. They love Keynesianism. I mean, like I said, I think for years that, Democrats don't see themselves as, like I said, I don't think Republicans don't see themselves as making a choice on this either. Like I said, George W. Bush passed this Medicare prescription drug bill. He sees himself as he fancies himself as a kind of redistributionist, and the Democrats they fancy themselves. And I would say the moderate blue dog, the Clinton era, tax cuts on capital. There's a genuinely pro-growth, wing in the Democratic Party, but they're not in power anymore. But yeah, the problem, of course, is that Keynes hasn't worked in this. I mean, my goodness. I mean, if you think about the country is running a deficit of $1.4 trillion every year. We've tripled our deficit. I mean, that's all stimulative in the sense that, the basic idea of Keynes was to increase government, run a deficit, increase spending to prop up demand. But all the models have just utterly failed, and they're just scrambling at this point to make, to account. They have all these sort of ad hoc, special pleading kind of arguments about why it hasn't worked. So I think that's part of the thing, is that as we have persistent sort of, economic weakness, Keynes has always been a very convenient, useful economist for them, because he allows them to be big government expansionists and pro-growth at the same time. But, we have had this massive expansion of government and no growth. So I think they're going to be. That's sort of the point. Is that I want to sort of suggest that when you move away from the extremes, not the extremes, and sort of like, the way that as an epithet is thrown about in American politics, which is really unfortunate, calling conservatives extreme, liberals extreme. They're not extreme. They're just conservatives and liberals. Outside of those two groups on the sides, on the poles, where this sort of freedom, justice rhetoric is really par for the course, and you sort of talk about that broad 40% or so where they fight. That battle's all been about blurring the differences. And I think that the problem now is that they're not able to blur the differences. Keynes is not getting the job done for them now.
Yes.
I just had a follow-up on the very first question about kicking the can down the road. It was interesting what you said, but I wasn't quite persuaded that it can't be kicked any further down the road, the economic problems. I mean, you said, I think in your talk, that within 20 years we're scheduled to reach the level of Greece in terms of...
Right.
But so why isn't it going to be, why can't we kick it down the road another 20 years? Why are the bondholders going to be making their demands within a year or 2 years, or if that was your suggestion?
Right. Well, I think that, I mean, it sort of speaks to the downgrade. What was it, S&P who downgraded? Was it S&P downgraded us? It was just sort of this sense that, I mean, ultimately, amazingly, at the moment, the deficit has gone higher and higher and higher. But we're actually paying a lower interest rate on our deficit right now than we were 10 years ago, in terms of actual dollars, where the interest on the debt that we're paying right now is lower because interest rates are low. And I think that the bond market's attention, I mean, I'm not a bond market person, so I can only speak sort of in an abstract term, sort of in political terms and policy terms. But, my sense of things is, A, the bond market's been distracted by what's happening in Europe. And B, nobody has an incentive in the United States failing. Nobody wants, the United States can't go into default. Like, you read articles from people talking about, well, maybe we should just let Greece go into default. We let that happen. I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see maximum leeway from the bond market to let the United States solve the problem politically through a political solution. But the downgrade from S&P suggests that this pressure, they're now starting to apply. They're doing it very gently and very carefully, and importantly, Moody's and Fitch didn't follow along with the downgrade. It's just sort of an early warning. You need to get your house in order, and I think that a lot of it right now is just being distracted by Europe as that works itself out. And I think a lot of it also is just sort of faith in the sort of like, well, let's wait and see if Federal Reserve's policies are going to work. They can, grow the economy and things like that. If the policy process is going to work, we'll just apply a little pressure now. But the point, though, I think the downgrade, it's going to be a political tool, which is very unfortunate in a lot of respects, but it's the way it goes. But the downgrade was substantial in that was the bond market, the market very, gently saying you need to start moving in this direction, which you haven't done. And I think I think we're going to see, especially if we get some sort of divided government at the end of this election process, I think we're going to see more of that. That would be very, very messy, I think, because I don't really see a lot of common ground between the two parties on this. It's fascinating to watch journalists cover politics in Washington. And sort of they talk about the politicians in Washington being so, oh, well, back in Reagan's day, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan could sit down over beer and hammer it all. Yeah, it's amazingly easy to solve political problems when you're growing at, what was it, 1983, 84, like 7% growth. It's amazing the common ground you can find, because what you do is you offer up to your bean counters, this is our solution, which isn't a very good solution to begin with. But the bean counters come back and say, well, everything's going to be fixed because the economy is going to grow at 4%. So you shake hands, you hold a big press conference, and you call yourselves great statesmen. Nowadays, Obama and John Boehner can't get along, they can't compromise because Boehner's so, he's such a partisan hack, and he's under the spell of those radical, nasty Tea Partiers, and conservatives say about him, oh, well, he's just a socialist, It's no, they can't compromise because there's no common ground. When you have what was the economic growth rate in 2011? 1.7%. When you have a budget deficit that's the size of what we have, and you have no economic growth, and there's no, you're going to have to cut. You have to cut meat. You can't just cut the fat. You have to cut muscle. That's the metaphor.
But isn't there a difference between? If we reach a point where we can't go on as we have been, that's different from positively adopting fundamental reforms.
Yes.
Change things, and so you might have an emergency Band-Aid kind of thing if there simply isn't money to pay.
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. Like I said, and I think that feeds into sort of my other point, which is the two parties don't want to. They don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about this because I love those old. I love the election of 1896. Political parties hate elections like that. They'd much rather have an election like 1924, where it's a no-brainer. One side just wins in a rout. Nobody talks about anything. The sort of elections that political scientists obsess over are the ones that politicians, they have fever dreams about at night. They don't want 1890. My goodness, they don't want something like that. That's dangerous to them. So. I don't. I don't not really see any Band-Aids that can be applied. That's sort of my. I haven't seen any. They tried to put some Band-Aids on last year, and I just didn't think they were real. I thought they were more gimmicks, and I don't think that over time, I don't think that the markets are going to put up with that as sort of a permanent kind of let's just keep putting when the government was going to shut down about a year ago in April of 2011, and it's like Chamberlain coming back from Munich with Hitler, peace in our time. And then it turns out spending actually increased last year. It was just all paper, sort of counting reductions and, the money we were never going to spend in Iraq as spending cuts, and then counting, they count, I love that they do this, they count interest on the debt that we weren't going to spend. They count that as a spending cut. So when they say we have $1 trillion in cuts, they actually only have like $800 billion in cuts. Well, the other 20 is just money we're not going to spend on interest. That's the sort of stuff. That's the problem. If we have another decade of 1.7 to 2.5% economic growth, I just don't see by 2022 that the bondholders are going to. I think they're just going to be. They're going to basically be doing what they're doing right now to Greece, which is, look, you have to get this together. We're done with you. And the problem, of course, too, is psychology of the bond market. I mean, you see, if you look at a track of Italian 10-year bonds, I mean, it just it's a herd mentality, you know. And the problem is that it feeds on itself, you know. It could be like a bubble almost. So.
Thanks, Jay. It's 2 o'clock. We want to thank you for a lively and informed presentation.
Thank you very much.